Hello, everyone. Now, I know that it's hard to keep up on top of what's going on in the Holy Land, but if you want to know more about what's happening here in Israel, I'm Aaron Porras, and this is the Weekly Review.
If you ask U.S. President Donald Trump or Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the Abraham Accords are far from over, and more countries are on the way to normalization with Israel. Sudan, for one, has been at the top of Trump's agenda, and he insists they will be among the next to join the Accords. According to reports from Israeli radio, an Israeli delegation flew to Khartoum on Wednesday for rare secret talks. Intelligence Minister Eli Cohen told Israeli television that he believes Israel is very close to normalization with Sudan. Earlier on Wednesday, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo saying that the U.S. was working to remove Sudan from its terror blacklist and also working diligently to secure a deal with Israel.
We also are continuing to work to get every nation to recognize Israel, the rightful Jewish homeland, and to acknowledge their basic fundamental right to exist as a country. That certainly includes Sudan, and we are working diligently with them to make the case for why that's in the Sudanese government's best interest to make that sovereign decision.
Moving on now, an Israeli police officer has been charged with reckless killing in the deadly shooting of a Palestinian man with autism in Jerusalem earlier this year. That shooting took place around the same time an African-American man, George Floyd, was killed by U.S. police, leading to a mass Black Lives Matter protest movement. Simultaneously in Israel, protesters of this incident held signs saying Palestinian lives matter. 32-year-old Iyad Halak, a resident of East Jerusalem, was heading to his school for students with special needs when he was killed. The officer being charged was not identified, and Halak's family has criticized the investigation. Okay, let's move on now. Deja vu. Israel is still in the process of exiting its second nationwide lockdown more than a month into it, and there is no telling when all the restrictions will finally disappear for the time being. Even the Prime Minister had to celebrate his birthday via Zoom. Here's the story.
After 6 hours of deliberations on Wednesday, ministers failed to reach a decision on the next steps in the move out of Israel's coronavirus lockdown. But Israel's COVID-19 cabinet meeting did include a special surprise for the prime minister in honor of his 71st birthday. During the meeting, Netanyahu proposed that the country's exit strategy, currently consisting of 9 stages, should be reduced to only 5.
לעבור משלב לשלב בהדרגה. לא יהיו 9 שלבים, יהיו פחות שלבים, אבל הם יהיו מדורגים. והדבר השלישי, אם נראה שיש עלייה בחזרה, כמו שקורה עכשיו במדינות אירופה, נאלץ להחזיר בחזרה חלק מההגבלות.
Israel's COVID-19 Commissioner Roni Gamzu arguing that exiting the lockdown should be even more gradual. The exit strategy's second stage is supposed to come into effect Sunday. If the rate of infection remains low and the number of new daily cases does not exceed 1,000, that could include the opening of grades 1 through 4. But a final decision regarding the reopening of schools and shops will be made next week.
אני מבקש את שיתוף הפעולה שלכם, כי ביחד נצליח.
Until then, here's where the country stands. Since Wednesday, there were 1,089 new cases. 231 patients are on ventilators, and the death toll stands at 2,292. Nittany Manson, ILTV.
Rocket fire launched into southern Israel again late Tuesday night. Palestinian terrorists in Gaza firing the projectile towards Israeli territory, tripping red alert sirens just before 9 p.m. Thankfully, the Iron Dome defense system intercepted the missile, preventing any injuries. And though no particular group has claimed responsibility for these latest attempted strikes, by 11:30 p.m., Israeli fighter jets and attack helicopters were retaliating against underground infrastructure belonging to the Hamas terror organization, which governs over the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, to Israel's north, the Sana news agency in Syria is alleging that a missile struck a school building overnight in a village in Qunetra's northern countryside. And though they don't provide any other details from the strike, the UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights is also reporting a missile attack in the region with several resulted casualties, adding that Israel was likely responsible. But they also go on to say that the attack hit a pro-Iran militia base. Israel has conducted hundreds of airstrikes on Iranian and Iran-affiliated forces in Syria over the last decade, vowing not to let hostile forces encroach upon the border. Israel rarely admits to any direct actions in Syria, though, And true to form, when asked about the alleged strikes, Defense Minister Benny Gantz replies, quote, "I won't go into who fired what last night. We won't allow terrorist operatives from Hezbollah or Iran to set up in the Golan Heights, and we will do whatever is necessary to drive them out of the area." Later adding, "Listen, things happen." In other news, the overnight rocket fire comes just hours after Israeli Defense Forces unveiled the latest discovery of an underground attack tunnel stretching from Gaza into Israel.
אני יכול להבטיח לתושבי האזור שעושים את הכל על מנת להבטיח להם חיים שקטים ובטוחים, שנו בשקט והמשיכו את הפעילות שלהם, וכמובן, בריאות לכולם.
Lofty words from the Israeli defense minister as the IDF announces pinpointing and neutralizing a terror tunnel from the Gaza Strip that stretches dozens of meters into Israeli territory near Kibbutz Kitzufim. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu similarly saying that we will continue to take determined action in all sectors for the security of Israel and against any attempt to attack our sovereignty or our citizens. According to the IDF, the tunnel was found during ongoing efforts to destroy such pathways into Israel, now with the aid of a sensory concrete barrier around Gaza that's quickly nearing completion. Military forces then blocking off the area and closing the crossings with Gaza for undisclosed engineering operations. Particularly alarming about this case, however, is that this tunnel was reportedly recently dug and independent of the network used by Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad until the IDF destroyed them in 2014. IDF spokesperson Brigadier General Zilberman adding that in recent years, tunneling has taken center stage among terrorist organizations, with this tunnel in particular receiving a lot of cash investments that should have been directed to social welfare in the Gaza Strip. And as per policy, the IDF will be holding Hamas responsible, though no group has claimed responsibility. In the meantime, as testing increases and infections drop, let's not forget that Israel also plans to begin phase 1 human trials on a vaccine candidate by the end of the month. The caveat being that rarely, if ever, has any vaccine gotten to human trials so quickly. So who are the brave souls signing up for this first study? The Israeli Institute for Biological Research, or IIBR, is announcing human trials for their proto-coronavirus vaccine beginning by the start of November, and recruitment for the trials reportedly began earlier in October. Well, altogether, 100 Israelis aged 18 to 55 are said to be participating in the trial, half to be used as a control, meaning they'll receive a placebo drug, while the other half gets the real deal. And director of the trial, Aaron Ben-Ami, says that it'll consist of one vaccine and then a year of follow-up checks, adding that the move from the first phase to the second phase could be just a matter of weeks. So would you be brave enough to sign up for the trial? Well, these 3 volunteers are. From left to right, meet 41-year-old father of 2, Dr. Zeev Yitzchakson Hayosh, 39-year-old Russian-Israeli immigrant and father of 2, Fried Zaprov, and 47-year-old engineer and father of 3, Boaz Kolodner. The volunteers telling Ynet News that they feel that they must do everything within their power to try and make a change and find something to fight against the virus.
אני מרגיש די בטוח, ברור שיש בזה איזושהי רמת סיכון, אבל לא נראה לי משהו שהוא מעבר לרמת החרדות שלי.
גדלתי על סיפורים של מדענים שחיסנו את עצמם, כל מיני דברים היסטוריים כאלה, הרגשתי שזה דבר נכון לעשות. אני מאמין שהדרך למגע להתמודד עם זה לאורך זמן בוודאות, זה אך ורק על ידי השקעה במדע, בנתונים מהימנים, במחקר ובמערכת הבריאות. כאילו זה תהיה הדרך היחידה לדעתי לחיות עם הווירוס החדש הזה שעכשיו כנראה לא הולך לעזוב אותנו בקרוב.
יש לי תחושה טובה, יש לי תחושה שהגוף שהכיל את החיסון והגוף שעורך את הניסוי יודע מה הוא עושה, ואני מאוד מאמין בשיטה המערבית לפתרון מגפות.
Our top story tonight, Israel hosting a momentous delegation from the United Arab Emirates today for a historic trilateral summit between Israel, the UAE, and the United States. The diplomatic missions arriving to sign a number of incredible agreements. It's the first ever official ministerial delegation from the United Arab Emirates to ever visit Israel publicly. And the trip, scheduled to last just 5 hours after touchdown, will include bilateral talks with the goal of implementing the Abraham Peace Accords signed in Washington last month. The UAE Economy Minister and Finance Minister leading the Emirati mission joined at Ben Gurion Airport by their Israeli and American counterparts. Passengers on the historic Etihad Airways jet applauding and celebrating their flight from Abu Dhabi. And Captain Naim Al-Ameri likewise blessing the trip, as shown in video uploaded to social media from on board.
Let's begin by saying this is a historical moment for UAE, country, Israel, and for better future within the region.
Now, for the ceremony itself, the official meet and greet at the airport was shortly followed by speeches from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, United States Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, UAE Finance Minister Obaid Humaid Al-Tayer, and others. Prime Minister Netanyahu, for one, saying that today we're making history that will stand for generations.
Once again, I welcome all our guests from the United Arab Emirates and from the United States. We shall remember this day a glorious day of peace.
Then, after speeches, the Israeli premier produced documents to be signed. The first being for the promotion and protection of investments, and the second being a memorandum of understanding on innovation in science and technology. But that's not all. A $3 billion investment fund between Israel, the UAE, and the U.S., appropriately titled the Abraham Fund, was also announced alongside several other agreements. The most exciting of which, however, is probably the agreement to sign visa exemptions with the UAE, the first such agreement between Israel and an Arab state, despite existing peace agreements with Jordan, Egypt, and now Bahrain. This means that citizens from both Israel and the UAE will be allowed to enter each other's countries without the red tape of applying for a visa.
Moving on now, the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict is raging. Azerbaijan's Prosecutor General's office says that at least 43 civilians have been killed and 218 injured due to the fresh Armenian attacks. And Armenia says it has lost more than 600 soldiers in the fighting. Now anger over the conflict is spreading even to Israel. More in the next report.
Nagorno-Karabakh, territory disputed by Azerbaijan and Armenia, has caused hundreds of deaths in a raging clash between the two countries. Now solidarity is spreading even to Israel. Many Azerbaijanis living in Petah Tikva gathering to protest against an Armenian attack that left dozens dead and over 200 others wounded. The crowd carrying flags of Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Israel, and chanting slogans against Armenia, holding signs saying "Justice for Azerbaijan." The Armenian National Committee of Jerusalem releasing a video on social media describing it as Armenian protesters on their way back from a peaceful protest in front of the Israeli Knesset, ambushed and attacked by an Azerbaijani mob. Some 20% of Azerbaijan's territory has remained under illegal Armenian occupation for nearly 3 decades. The recent clashes erupted between the two countries on September 27th, and since then Armenia has continued attacks on civilians and Azerbaijani forces.
Bak Azerbaycan'ın biz İsrail vatandaşı olarak buraya toplaştık. Biz Azerbaycan'ın bütünlüğünü istiyoruz.
Many world powers, including Russia, France, and the U.S., have urged a new ceasefire. Turkey, meanwhile, has supported Baku's right to self-defense and demanded the withdrawal of Armenia's occupying forces. Nittany Manson, ILTV.
Now, speaking of business, one of the biggest economic outcomes of the peace deal with the United Arab Emirates so far is now unveiled. An Israeli firm now signing agreements to pipe Emirati oil all the way to Europe. The Memorandum of Understanding signed between the state-owned Europe-Asia Pipeline Company and the Med-Red Land Bridge Company, a new joint venture between Israelis and Emiratis. This during the brief landmark visit on Tuesday by American and Emirati officials in Israel. And essentially, the parties have agreed to extend the existing pipeline between Eilat and the Israeli port city of Ashkelon all the way to the Arab Gulf. The agreement, coming at a value of between $700 to $800 million over the next several years, with plans to hopefully begin supplying by early 2021. The Palestinian Authority, meanwhile, is of course again condemning the United Arab Emirates, though both for their signing of the Abraham Peace Accords and for their visit to Israel this week itself. But the comments are seemingly backfiring as senior PLO diplomat Saeb Erekat continues to receive treatment for coronavirus in Israel's Hadassah hospital. Health officials saying that he's now been put on an ECMO life support machine while resting in critical but stable condition. Moving on, chief Palestinian negotiator Saeb Erekat is now still in critical but stable condition, according to Israeli hospital officials, following the senior diplomat's admission to the intensive care unit at Israel's Hadassah Medical Center. Erekat suffering from severe complications with the coronavirus, mixed with his suppressed immune system, courtesy of a lung transplant in 2017. But Erekat's health aside, his admission into Israel for medical treatment in and of itself is stirring controversy, both in Israel and in the West Bank. Several Knesset members from across the political spectrum in Israel at first arguing that Erekat's reception be conditioned on the return of 4 Israeli captives being held by Hamas in Gaza since 2015. Hadar Golden, Oron Shaul, Avera Mengistu, and Hisham al-Sayed. Meanwhile, Israeli citizens are gathering in protest at the hospital, including family members of victims of Palestinian terrorists.
I'm here today to protest. My daughter Dalia was brutally murdered 6 years ago. Today, in the center of Jerusalem, in Hadassah and Kerem, we are treating an arch-terrorist. He calls for the demise of Israel and the murder of the Israeli people. And now today he came to our medical services to ask for help.
Now, speaking of maintaining vigilance, Zaka Search and Rescue is now calling on the public not only to continue following with health guidelines, but also to check in with our neighbors and our community members on a daily basis, especially if they're old or alone. And this after the Volunteer Emergency Response Group reports discovering their 121st body this year, found days after the person had died. The latest being a 42-year-old man from Ashdod who was found when his neighbors told police that a terrible smell had begun leaking into the stairwell. But coronavirus aside, people are passing away alone, and that's an ongoing issue, with 130 people reportedly dying alone in Israel in 2019. Zaka officials saying that with pain and tears and respect, we handled the deceased at this difficult scene, adding that if you have a lonely or childless neighbor, check on them at least once a day and report to welfare authorities in order to save their lives. Meanwhile, Zaka and Yad Sarah organization are also now pairing together to provide emergency alert buttons and sensors to the elderly to prevent such incidents in the future. And finally, with United States presidential elections coming in hot this November, it may be too late to order your absentee ballots if you haven't already. But for Americans in Israel who are prepared and eligible, the election is in full swing. Nittany Manson reporting.
With hundreds of thousands of American voters living here in Israel, both Democrats and Republicans abroad are campaigning hard. The presidential election overseas now already beginning to count absentee ballots. But as expected, concerns of expat voters differ slightly to the majority of those held by their American Jewish counterparts. The coronavirus crisis, economic policy, and the candidates' policies on Israel being among the most influential topics at the ballots. So with that in mind, then, it comes as no surprise that many Israelis are touting the Middle East accomplishments of President Donald Trump.
I think it'll be a tremendous effect. I mean, look at what Trump has done already in his 4 years for Israel, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, and with his economic and political policies that have helped the relations between the U.S. and Israel will continue to become even stronger when he is reelected this 2020.
I think that Trump is good for Israel for many reasons. I think one of the biggest things he did was he took a different approach to the Middle East peace. He took more of an economical approach, which I think what it'll do is it'll turn the Middle East into something similar to the EU, but to have states of Muslims, mostly Muslim states, and Israel that can cooperate economically with each other. And when you have economic cooperation and people are all living in good times, it makes good roads to peace. And I think that's the most important thing for Israel is the peace.
Again, though, not everyone's jumped on the Trump bandwagon.
Overwhelming majority of the Democratic Party, including Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, have a decades-long record, of being staunchly pro-Israel, unquestionably pro-Israel. And it's a pro-Israel that stems from a deep understanding of Israel's geostrategic role, also in relation to the United States' interest in the Middle East. And there is no room for anti-Semitism in the Democratic Party.
Chair of Democrats Abroad Israel, Heather Stone, likewise saying they've even recently doubled their membership.
I think that the voters in Israel will have a big impact on the election, particularly in several states and districts. And voters overseas in general will have a big impact. We've seen increased interest in voting, and registrations are up about threefold, and membership in Democrats Abroad has doubled. And we believe that it's looking like we are going to be the margin of victory in several places.
But still, no one is going down without a fight, leaving the result of American Israelis' votes a mystery, at least for now.
People
in the United States there are many, many millions who love Israel, and they know how much the administration has done for Israel in these past 4 years. And they want to see people here in Israel saying thank you. In fact, that's what that sign over there says behind me. It says, "We owe a debt of gratitude to Donald Trump for all the things he's done for Israel, for America, and indeed for the world."
All right, changing gears, Israeli Antiquities authorities are practically always coming out with something new, or old, but new for us. Either way, there's a whole lot of antiquity to go around, and now you're invited to hear all about it.
More than 40 scholars, experts in their field, have now been gathered for an incredible and international conference set to take place online between October 25th and October 28th, and the public is invited to listen in for free. Hosted by the Israel Antiquities Authority, the Friends of the IAA, and in collaboration with NYU Tel Aviv, the summit has been titled The Land That I Will Show You, with session topics reportedly set to include recent excavations in Israel, religion and society in the Iron Age, new discoveries in Jerusalem, urbanization between the old and the new land of Canaan, and much more, all related to discoveries from ancient Israel. But sign up fast, because while participation and registration in the conference may be free for all, capacity has been limited and registration is required for each day of the summit you want to view. Find out more and register at the Israel Antiquities Authority Facebook page.
Finally, in other news, we just can't get enough history here at ILTV. Israel's civil administration now unveiling an amazing archaeological discovery made in a dig site close to the town of Beit El in Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank. The ancient site dating back to the Second Temple period. And it includes an ancient water hole in which the recent discovery itself was made. A cache of ancient ceramic jars was found. Experts explaining that apparently the hole was part of a residential Jewish neighborhood that lived in the area roughly 2,000 years ago. And then the jars and other artifacts that were found were also found stored neatly in large plastered niches carved into the sides of the watering hole, indicating that at some point the space was likely repurposed as storage. And that's it for ILTV's Weekly Review. I'm Aaron Porras. See you next week.